Hey class, today we're going to be covering the topic of memory, which spans several modules. Um, Memory is the learning over time and how well that has persisted. And we're going to talk in a little bit about the processes involved in memory, encoding, storage, and retrieval, and how that works, but also why sometimes different ways that can go wrong. So you aren't going to have to know for the test any of the brain regions that are involved in any of the memory processes, even though it shows that on the screen. The point is just to know that lots of different areas of the brain are involved in encoding information, and also storing information and allowing us to retrieve that information. So it's not like there's just one specific memory area of the brain or anything like that. There's a lot of parts in the brain working to achieve those things. So one of the first topics addressed in Module 22 has to do with how do we measure memory? So consider you learn something and it gets stored in your brain, and then how can we measure how good memory is? Well, one way we can do that is through a recall task. And a recall task involves you searching through memory to find information that you stored. Recall tasks on an exam would be equivalent to like a fill-in-the-blank question or an essay question. A lot of times students don't like those types of tasks because they are a little challenging. You have a lot of information in your brain to kind of sift through to complete a recall task. So for example, even if you've never seen Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, you may have heard enough about that in the dwarfs to be able to recall some of the dwarfs. So if you want, you can pause the video and just kind of mentally to yourself or jot them down, see how many of those dwarfs you can recall. So pause the video now if you want to do that. Otherwise, I'm gonna keep moving on. Most students have a difficult time recalling all 7 dwarfs. And when I do this in a traditional classroom, when I survey the class, generally most students have 3 or 4 names. But another way we can measure retention is with a recognition task. And recognition tasks tend to be easier because you're provided information, and then you just have to look at that information or check that information and see if it's something that you have stored in memory. So that would be equivalent to like a multiple choice test, which students generally like multiple choice tests. So I can change this task with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs to a recognition task. And when I do this in class, most students can complete their list of 7 dwarfs once they have the chance to see a bunch of names. They generally will recognize the ones that they couldn't recall. So the idea here is that recognition is a lot easier than recall. And if you think about it, let's say you met somebody a year ago, and then you see them again a year later. So is it easier to recall that person's name, or is it easier to recognize their face? Most people would agree that recognizing their face would be much easier than being able to recall their name. There is another topic in the book in this section called relearning. You are not going to have to know that for the test, and that's why I'm not going to cover that one. But feel free to read it if you're interested in it, but we're going to move on. So I'm going to give you a little memory test here, and you're going to need a piece of paper, just a piece of scratch paper or something to write with. And I'm going to put some words up on the screen in a little bit, and your task is to just read through the list of words about 1 word per second. And when you get to the end of the list, you just go through the list one time. When you get to the end of the list, then turn away from the screen and don't look back up at it, because this is a memory task. So when you get through the list one time, look away from the screen and then just start writing down as many of the words as you can recall from the list. Remember not to look back at the screen though, because that would kind of defeat the whole purpose of this being a memory test, right? Okay, so here are the list of words. You read through them one at a time. Now you can pause the video and then unpause it after you're done writing your list. Go ahead, pause it. Go ahead, pause it while you write your list. Okay, so I assume that you're done writing your list now, and I have a couple questions I'm going to ask you about what words were on that list. Did you write the word bed? Usually about 70 or 75% of students wrote the word bed. Did you write the word sleep? Oftentimes about 35 or 40% of people on this task will write the word sleep, even though that word was not actually on the list. This task is really to demonstrate that memory is not perfect. In fact, if you look at your list, you probably didn't recall all those words, even though you had just read through them, which tells us that memory is somewhat limited in how much we can store at any given time. But also the fact that sometimes people will write words and be pretty confident that it was on the list when in fact it's not. And one of the reasons for that with this task, why do some people write the word sleep, for example, is that all these words have to do with the topic of sleep. And when we store information in memory, we store it in an associated manner. And what I mean by that is we categorize information in memory. So along with all of the words you see on the screen are other related words like sleep. And so when you're retrieving information from memory, you're actually reconstructing memories. You're actually pulling bits and pieces of information related to what you saw, the words, but also what sneaks in there are these related terms and concepts that are also categorized. This is why those like word association tests, if I were to tell you to name the first thing that pops in your head when I say the word furry, most people will say animal or dog or cat. Nobody ever says bottle. Nobody ever says paper. The things that we recall immediately are those things that are stored in memory in an associated way. So I don't really care how many words you got correct. That wasn't really the purpose of this activity. It was really just to show that memory is distorted. Sometimes we recall false memories, like the word sleep. If you recalled that and you were confident, that would be a false memory. So there are many different models of memory. I had no idea how many models of memory there were until I was in grad school and I took a course on memory. And most of us probably are familiar with the standard short-term and long-term memory terms. But there's lots of models to explain really specific things about memory. And then there's some models that are kind of explain the general processes. When we're going to look at two models here, This one is referred to as the information processing model, and it comes from the cognitive perspective in psychology, and it views memory, some memory processes is almost like the way a computer processes information. So first part of this memory model is encoding, which means we have to get the stimuli from our external environment encoded in a way that the brain can process. So we talked earlier in the semester about neurons communicating with each other by way of chemical messages, right, through neurotransmitters. And those chemical messages are how the brain encodes visual information and auditory information and all kinds of things, right? We don't actually, our brain doesn't see light waves. What our brain gets from the neurons on our retina are chemical messages related to those light waves. So that's how encoding works. Just like on a computer, if you were to press the letter L on your computer doesn't actually process the letter L. What your computer encodes is actually a unique series of ones and zeros that represents the letter L. All the keys on the keyboard are encoded that way. I think it's called the binary code. Once we get information encoded, then we can store it just like you would store files on a computer, on your CPU or memory stick or whatever. And then when we can retrieve those documents from your computer, you can retrieve those files just like we can retrieve memories that have been stored. There's one thing here that a computer would have an advantage over a human, and that is when you store your paper, a typed paper on your computer, and retrieve it. When you retrieve it, it's generally the exact same as it was when you stored it. Unfortunately, human memory is not like that. Because we reconstruct information, we pull bits and pieces of stored information from different areas of the brain, we pull that together to recreate the memory. That leaves our recalled memories with some degree of error. Memory is pretty good, but as we'll see as we move through some more of this material in this section about memory, that there's a lot of room for error also. But imagine if you had a computer that worked like human memory. So you would store your typed paper, and then the next day you retrieve it to do some more work on it, and now some of the sentences are missing, some of the words have been switched, some of the punctuation has been switched, some of the formatting has changed. That'd be really frustrating, right? Well, that is how our memory works. We don't always notice that because oftentimes those little changes are pretty insignificant. So if we look more closely at encoding, encoding is really the critical component to getting information stored in the first place. We don't really encode everything that we experience because our brain can only process so much information. What we tend to encode is the stuff we pay attention to. Even then, oftentimes we don't encode all the details, even something we've seen thousands of times. So for example, there's images here of a variety of pennies, which you've probably seen literally thousands of times. But it's very challenging for people to identify the correct penny among all of these. Now, if you want to take some time to look at this and just do it from memory, don't actually get a penny out, but just see if you can identify the correct penny. If you want some time to study those, you can pause the video right now. When you're ready to see the answer revealed, unpause the video. So pause now if you want to pick one of those yourself. Okay, so the correct penny is the very first one, A. And the reason that this is a difficult task for most people is because we don't really pay attention to all the details of a penny. And if you don't pay attention to details, you tend not to encode it very well. If it's not encoded, it's not going to get stored very well. What we do pay attention to with pennies is what we need to know. We need to be able to tell it apart from other coins. So we know its approximate size and color and its value. You might know the president that's on the coin because you've seen that enough, and that kind of stands out and is fairly obvious. But when it comes to all the details, the words, where the dates are, unless you're a coin collector, you probably don't really pay that much attention to it. So you don't really get that encoded very well. Okay, now I'm going to show you a video. Just want you to watch this video, and only takes about a minute. All right, so now you get to take an eyewitness identification test, see if you can pick that person out of a lineup.
This is a good one.
And if you want to see them a little bit more, those are your suspects. So which one do you think was the guy who was caught planting that bomb and putting it down the air shaft? Well, when I do this in class, there are quite a variety of answers. Generally, I think the guy in the top row in the middle gets the most votes, followed by the guy on the lower right corner, the bottom row on the right end. But in fact, none of these are the suspect. So people have a difficult time based on memory identifying suspects. And one of the reasons eyewitness identification is actually pretty difficult is because of the encoding issue. We don't really have time to encode all the details. And so when we do, what information we do encode in memory is stored in different areas of the brain. And then when you have to try to recall or recognize that image, your recall of that image from memory can be distorted. And what usually happens in a case like this, when the actual perpetrator is not in the lineup, is that people pick a person that looks most similar to them and can be pretty darn confident. And a little bit later, I'll show you some websites you can go to related to people who were identified as criminals and prosecuted in the court of law when years later DNA evidence was able to recognize them as actually not being guilty of that crime. So a lot of cases like that, unfortunately. So we talked about encoding. Most of what we encode requires effort, like studying academic knowledge from a book. You have to kind of pay attention and focus in order to get that information encoded. But remember, we do have a dual track mind. So sometimes information kind of gets encoded automatically without any effort. And I'm going to talk about those two processes a little bit. First of all, the automatic processing. These lead to what we call implicit memories. It's a type of long-term memory that doesn't really require conscious thought or conscious recall. So in sports, a lot of times it would refer to something like this as muscle memory. where you learn something so well you don't have to really think about it. If you play a musical instrument, once you learn where the keys are or where the strings are for different notes, it over time becomes very automatic. Just like typing too. If you're really good at typing, you don't even really think about where the keys are, or you don't really think about where the strings and notes are. Your fingers just kind of automatically go to the right to the right place, and that's really useful that our brain can do that, because that allows us frees up our brain to process other information. So the image I put there is a guy tying his shoes, and I do that because that's a muscle memory task too. When you're little and you're first learning to tie your shoes, it's not the case. It's very fact-based. Crossing the strings over, putting one through the hole, making a loop, wrapping it around the loop. But as you get good at that, it becomes it's stored as an implicit memory, meaning now at the age you're at now, you can tie your shoes without even really thinking about what your fingers are doing. You can have a conversation with somebody while you're tying your shoes. I've even had cases where I've done something while I'm talking to somebody, and then noticed that I actually got something done, and was like, wow, that's weird. I have no idea I did that. I do that all the time, actually, when I back out of our driveway. I close the garage door when I get out on the driveway, and it's such a habit that I don't even remember closing the garage door, pushing the button. And usually, as I take off, I have to actually look to see if the garage door is down, because I never remember pushing the button. It's just part of this, process, a habit. Those kinds of things are all processed automatically. So I have some examples on the screen here of things that get stored as implicit memories. Remember, classical conditioning, those are involuntary or automatic responses, things you don't even think about. When you are faced with a certain stimuli, it can automatically elicit a certain response without even thinking about it. So by and large, though, a lot of stuff, most of the stuff that we get stored in memory, we have to get it encoded, and it takes effort. So we call that effortful processing. And so just like reading a book, if you daydream while you're reading a page in your textbook, you can get to the end of the page and have no idea what you read. I think every college student has experienced that from time to time. And the point is, even though you read every word, you didn't really get it encoded in memory because you weren't paying attention to it. So that's one of the challenges facing college students, especially if you're taking a course that isn't interesting to you and it may be difficult to pay attention, is figuring out a way to keep yourself focused. So this information that requires effort and attention and focus, a lot of this would be fact-based information, and those would be stored as what we call explicit memories. So a little later we'll look at this again when we go over long-term memories. So the other model of memory, we just talked about one, which was encoding, storage, and retrieval. This model of memory is a famous model by Atkinson and Shiffrin. And this is kind of a general model that explains how memory seems to work and different ways that memory gets stored. And I'd like to go over this as a whole model because the textbook has it broken up a little bit into sections. And I don't feel like the textbook really covers long-term memory very clearly. So I want to just go over this process. In this model of memory, there are three storage areas. Sensory memory here, short-term or working memory here, and long-term memory. And the sensory memory is a very, very brief storage component. everything you hear and see is stored in sensory memory for visual information is stored for a split second. Auditory information is stored for up to 4 seconds here. Only the stuff we pay attention to will actually transfer to short-term or working memory. Most of the other things that are going on around us are going to be forgotten. That's a really bad arrow. I don't know why I started drawing with my mouse instead of my little pen, but anyway, so most of this stuff is going to be lost because we're not paying attention to it. If sensory memory is kind of hard for students to understand sometimes, so but if you think about this, like when you're taking notes in class, sometimes after your teacher gets done, ends a sentence, you still kind of hear the last couple words in your brain. That would be the auditory or echoic memory, as it's sometimes called. The visual information, though, lasts even briefer, only a split second. And you can demonstrate that, though. It's hard to understand why a memory could only last a split second. But the stuff you're paying attention to, remember, will go into working or short-term memory. And even though visual information only lasts a split second, and that's hard for students to understand, but you can demonstrate that if you take your pen or pencil and wave it in front of your face really fast. And when you do that, you should see a blurred image. What causes the blur is the very brief storage of your pen or pencil in those various places as it's moving through space. That blur ends or disappears within a split second, right? And so that blur, though, is just really your sensory memory, the split second storage of the visual stimuli around you. So once we have things that we're paying attention to, that information can go to short-term memory or working memory. And short-term memory is the term we use really when we're talking about the capacity and how long information lasts in short-term memory. Working memory is the term we use when we're actively thinking about information in this stage of memory. So it's a little hard to understand, but so if I simply read a short list of words and I'm paying attention to those, those words will make their way to short-term memory. That will last in memory unless I do something with that information, unless I repeat it or think of it in some unique way to make it really interesting. That information will probably only last about 20 seconds or less. That number varies depending on what kind of memory books you're reading, but it doesn't last very long. But if you do something with that information, if you rehearse it or repeat it over and over, or you think of it in some unique way, then you're working with that information cognitively. And when you do that, then that information can eventually get to long-term memory, where it could be stored potentially for a lifetime. Also, there's a lot of things that we have stored in long-term memory that we retrieve. So I'm going to ask you a question right now. This is a retrieval cue. I want you to think of your high school graduation ceremony. And by asking that question, you've probably just searched long-term memory for that information and retrieved that. And that information is now in your working memory as you're actively thinking about that. So there's a lot of stuff we can get in long-term memory. We don't even know for sure what the capacity for that is, because there's so much stuff in long-term memory that we don't even know what's in there unless something prompts us to retrieve it. So unless there's a retrieval cue. So just to kind of review a little bit here, the sensory memory is the initial sensory experience that gets stored less than 4 seconds. Visual information is typically gone in a split second, but up to 4 seconds, I suppose. The information that you pay attention to will move on to the next stage called short-term or working memory. Most of the other stuff will be forgotten. Short-term or working memory has a limited capacity of about 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. And now I learned that all the time in college, in a bunch of courses I had and textbooks, and I always just kind of took that at face value, that short-term memory has a limited capacity. But I think at one point when I was in graduate school, I really kind of thought about what that meant, and it didn't make sense to me. The reason it didn't make sense to me is because a teacher could speak a sentence in class with, like, let's say 15 or 20 words, and I would understand the whole sentence. It's not like I only understood the first 7 words and then, couldn't process the rest of it. So I got kind of confused about really what this 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information means. And so I had to check into that more out of curiosity. And what this really applies to, 7, give or take a couple pieces of information, it really has to do with information that's new to you and information that's not meaningful. So if it's something that you have stored in long-term memory already, for example, well, then you can work with a lot more information. For example, we have the alphabet stored in long-term memory. And the alphabet, we can retrieve 26 bits of information and think about that and recite the whole thing. But that's different because that's not new information. If you were to teach somebody the alphabet for the first time and you read all 26 letters, how many letters would you expect that person to recall after the first time hearing them? Probably about 5. And that's what this 7, give or take 2 pieces of information is referring to. It's information that's new and not meaningful in some way to you. So I want to demonstrate that because I always think that this is a fun task that I do in class. And I'm going to read you a series of 5 numbers. And I want you to write the 5 numbers down when I say go. And then I'm going to pause a little bit and give you time to write it down. And then I'm going to move to a 6-digit number and then a 7-digit number, etc. And you'll see by the time we get to 7 and 8 digits, it's actually pretty challenging. So this demonstrates the short-term memory capacity of about 7, give or take a couple pieces of information. All right, so get ready to write when I say go. The first number is 23906. Go. The next one, 139364. Go. The next one, 816478. Go. The next one, 2370146. Go. So for most students, 8 digits is too much. Like, most students start flip-flopping numbers and forgetting some of the numbers. This is the 9-digit number, which is, for most people, is pretty much maxing out short-term memory capacity. 792107696. Go. Again, for most of you, it's also probably pretty challenging. So if you want to check your answers, you can just rewind this video a little bit and kind of go back over those. But that's kind of the idea here, is that if information is completely novel or new to us in some way, short-term memory can only handle so much of that, right? Now, if I gave you the 9-digit number and it happened to be really similar to your like Social Security number, something maybe you have stored in long-term memory, then you would be able to process that more easily, because then I'm giving you a 9-digit number, but you're using long-term memory to tie it into that and make that meaningful to you, right? And so that would be a little different. But for most students, these numbers are completely random and don't really have any significance to them. So that's a pretty challenging task. Sometimes if we don't do something meaningful with that information, like if we don't repeat it or rehearse it, or if we don't like think of some interesting way, make it interesting or meaningful to us, we will also forget that probably within about 20 seconds. So if you hide the numbers that you just wrote down, so don't look at them, and try to recall the 6-digit number that I read to you about a minute ago. Most students cannot recall that 6-digit number, because even though it falls within the normal capacity for short-term memory, they did not rehearse it, or they did not do something to make it meaningful to themselves, like they didn't relate it to something, similar numbers that they have stored in long-term memory, for example. So that also demonstrates that if we don't do something with that information cognitively, generally it will leave short-term memory within about 20 seconds. There are tricks, little things we can do to keep information in short-term memory longer, and if we do them well, sometimes they even make it their way into long-term memory. So little mnemonics, for example, if you might have learned a lot of these in school. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. That's a memory trick, a little phrase that's kind of easier for people to remember. And it stands for the order of operations in math, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. Holmes is a mnemonic device for the Great Lakes. So there's all kinds of little memory tricks and things we can do. Organizing information in hierarchies helps us to store that information in organized ways. That's why when students are note-taking, we encourage them to use indents to keep things categorized and in a hierarchical kind of way. Keep it organized, and your brain can process that a little bit better and maintain that information a little bit better. So chunking is also something that we do. And chunking is just kind of grouping information together to reduce the number of pieces. And a lot of times people will do this if they recite a phone number to themselves. So let's say the phone number I give somebody is 3057246. And that's 7 bits of information, which is kind of challenging because of short-term memory's limited capacity. So when people recall that, repeat it to themselves, oftentimes they'll use chunking, and they'll repeat that as 3057246. And basically taking that information from 7 bits of information down to 5. Because now you just have 5 numbers to remember. And that is generally easier for short-term memory to handle that. So, all right. So another thing we can do with information in short-term memory is to relate it to something that you already have stored in long-term memory. And when I got my debit card years ago, there was a PIN number that had been assigned, a 4-digit PIN number, and I thought, how am I going to remember that PIN number? It's not like I'm using this constantly every day. And I knew like early on, until I got that stored well in memory, that it might be easy for me to forget that information. So I took the 4 numbers and I thought of 2 famous football players who had those numbers on their jersey. And then, so all I had to do then to remember my PIN number was to use long-term memory and recall those 2 famous football players, and then the jersey numbers that were stored with that information in long-term memory. So I used something I already had stored in long-term memory to help me process that information. So my PIN number was here when I first got it. I related it to something I had in long-term memory, and then was able to keep that stored in long-term memory because of that. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we process information, and then we'll tie this into long-term memory. When we're thinking about information or processing it and encoding it, sometimes we encode information at a very shallow level, which makes it difficult to store it well. Sometimes we think really well with information. So when we're processing information, we think about the meaning of it. We think about why it's important. You might analyze information or apply it to a real life scenario or apply it to your life. When we do something like that, and we're actually thinking about the information in a meaningful way, that's called deeper processing, and we actually encode that information much better and store it much better. That also makes it a lot easier to retrieve that information. So in my class, I have a list of 24 words that I read to students. The students are given different instructions for what they're supposed to do when they hear that word, and then generally the group that processed the information more meaningfully recalls about twice as many words. It's a pretty significant number because they're processing the information, the meaning of the words, where the other group is doing something much more shallow. I'm not going to say what that is because I have a task similar to that for this class, and you should get some information about that in Blackboard. So if we look at the types of long-term memory on this slide, we mentioned that sometimes information is processed automatically. Oops, pardon. Sometimes information is processed automatically, and we said that those lead to implicit memories. And here are some examples of implicit memories. I mentioned some motor skills like muscle memory, classically conditioned responses, things like when you're studying also, if you study information from your textbook over and over and over again, sometimes you automatically encode other things too, like there might be an illustration or an image or picture on the page of the textbook, and later you can recall approximately where that information was located on the page, even though you didn't really make any effort to encode that. It just kind of got there automatically. We also said that when we make an effort to pay attention to and think meaningfully about information, that tends to be related to our factual knowledge, which is called explicit memories. And explicit memories fall into 2 categories. The semantic, which I tend to think of as like the encyclopedia information in your brain. Maybe Wikipedia is more appropriate for today's generation. But we also have other types of factual information called episodic memory. And episodic memory are episodes or events from the past that you've experienced. They could be personally relevant, like thinking of your graduation ceremony would be an episodic memory. Thinking you might recall the events that you saw on TV associated with 9/11. Those would be episodic memories, even though that didn't happen to you. You weren't in the building, but you still remember the events in watching those events on TV. So those are two different types of explicit memories, and this is what we have in long-term memory. It can last potentially a lifetime. A little bit later, we'll talk about why we sometimes have difficulty retrieving information that's in long-term memory. But this is a very large capacity. We're not even sure exactly how much information we can store in here. So Module 23 talks about memory retrieval. And this is just one part of learning. As you see there, we pay attention to information, we can get it encoded, we can store it, and then we have to be able to retrieve it. And this module addresses some of those retrieval topics. One thing we know is that you can prime your memory to help you retrieve information. So as you see on the screen, hearing the word rabbit later when asked to spell hare, which could be spelled two different ways, people are more likely to spell it H-A-R-E, as in terms of the hare, in terms of a rabbit, rabbit type hair, whatever you call it. I don't know, that's weird, but because rabbits have hair or fur too. So, but you get the idea here, that these things we experienced earlier can subconsciously prime us to retrieve related information. And that's what it's called. It's called priming. Sometimes when we learn information and we're in a certain physical context or physical environment, as we're learning that information, we are also encoding, maybe at an unconscious or automatic level, we're also encoding other information about the environment. And so the idea here is that whatever environment you learn something in and get it stored in memory, you'll have an easier time recalling that information if you're in the same environment, because the environment will actually help serve as a retrieval cue for you. So this was an interesting experiment where they had people learn a list of words. Some of the people learned the list of words underwater, and some of them learned the list of words on land. And then later they were asked to recall as many words as they could. And words heard underwater were better recalled when the people were underwater. Words that people learned when they were on land were better learned when they were on land. You can see the comparison to the people who learned the list of water, or who learned the list of words underwater. When they recalled them on land, their recall was not as good. And likewise, the people who learned the list of words on land did not recall as many words as well while they were underwater. So even though might not be consciously paying attention to and thinking about the environment that we're in, our brain, again, operates at two levels. So that's the dual track brain or dual track mind. So our brain is also processing in the background information about the physical environment that we're in. Sometimes if there's an eyewitness to a crime and they're having a difficult time recalling information about the crime, sometimes I'll actually take them back to the scene of the crime. And when they get back in that environment, they might see something in that environment that suddenly serves as a retrieval cue and helps them to recall important information. But our internal environment can also serve as retrieval cues. So your physiological or emotional state as you're learning something can get encoded with that information as well. And so this is why I think sometimes people will say that chewing mint gum is helpful for taking tests. And I think what that really boils down to is that if you chew mint gum, sorry, our dogs are barking. If you chew mint flavored gum while you're studying, your brain is also encoding information about that flavor. And then later, when you're asked to recall that information, if you have that flavor present in your mouth again, it can help serve as retrieval cues. So I don't know if it's mint in particular that does it. I think it has more to do with state-dependent memory, and that is any flavor of gum you're chewing while you study could get encoded, and if you have that same flavor of gum when you're being tested, it can help serve as a retrieval cue. And this same idea applies to your mood states as well, or emotional states. So when we're in a good mood, information about our mood state also gets encoded with the memory of the information that we're learning. And so later you're more likely to recall that information if you're in a similar mood state. And you can see that data from this study were related to state-dependent memory. When people learned a list of words while they were intoxicated, they recalled more words when they were intoxicated, or they made fewer errors when they were intoxicated than they did when they were sober. But people who learned the list of words when they were sober made fewer recall errors when they were sober than they did when they were intoxicated. And of course, you can also see it. People who were sober made fewer errors overall compared to people who were intoxicated. But the point is that whatever their internal physiological state was, they tended to perform better in recall tasks when their internal state was the same during recall. So another thing is called the serial position effect, and this occurs when we are exposed to a lot of information. Our tendency to remember either the beginning of the list or the end of the list better than the middle of the list. And I think this could come into effect maybe sometimes in college when students are studying and they study, like, let's say like chapter 5, 6, and 7. And then when they review 5, 6, and 7, and then they review again, they go over 5, 6, and 7. And the idea there is it's possible that you'll have better recall of chapter 5 and 7 and maybe struggle more with your recall of the information from chapter 6 because of the serial position effect. And so I don't know how big of an impact that has in college, quite honestly, but I guess one thing you could do if you're studying things in a sequence like that is to change the sequence up each time you review. Just like if you're studying with flashcards, shuffle your cards up and really challenge your memory to encode that in different positions as in terms of the sequence anyway. So Module 24 covers the topic of forgetting, and there are lots of reasons that we forget, and those will be covered, several of those will be covered here in this module. One of the reasons we forget is due to encoding failure, which means we didn't really get the information encoded very well to begin with, and therefore we have difficult time recalling or retrieving that information. So there's a lot of things, just like, trying to identify the correct penny like we did earlier. We don't really encode all that information. So then it makes it difficult to recognize the correct penny because we're not really sure what all information is on the penny and where it's located. Another thing is that sometimes information gets encoded and stored, but it can kind of decay over time. And this is really relevant to academics in college or any school situation where you study a bunch of information for a test and you retain it pretty well in long-term memory, long enough to take the test. But over time, the retention tends to drop pretty rapidly within the first couple days. And this is why I always think it's important for teachers when students take tests and quizzes is to get them feedback quickly, because I had classes in the past where we took a test and then we didn't get it back for like an entire week. Well, 7 days later, you've already forgotten a lot of that information. It's decayed. And so it's hard to say, like, why did I make the errors I did on this test? How can I learn from that when I don't even recall the information anymore? So one way you can prevent that is to review the information, to keep it fresh in memory. And that's why if you have a class with a comprehensive final exam, there's really a huge payoff to kind of reviewing information a little bit over the course of the semester, because you know you're going to be tested over that again at the end of the semester. You can keep that information stored in memory a lot better over the course of the semester if you just review it a little bit once in a while. Now, this doesn't happen with all memories because some memories get encoded really well. So like some personal life events that are very emotional, you don't have to review those frequently to keep them in long-term memory. So, you might remember the day you got your driver's license. Well, that was a really fun, happy, emotional moment for you that got encoded really well. So you don't have to necessarily review that very often to keep that fresh in memory. Sometimes we have the information in long-term memory and we just can't quite retrieve it. And sometimes it's called the tip of the tongue phenomenon. Like if you're trying to recall someone's name, you're like, oh, it's right on the tip of my tongue. You know it's in there, but you just can't retrieve it. You might even know like the first letter or of their name, but you can't quite get their name. And that's just that sometimes we just can't quite retrieve it, even though it's in there. Sometimes we have difficulty because of interference. And proactive interference is when when prior learning has an effect on our ability to recall new information. Retroactive interference is when new learning has a negative effect on our ability to recall earlier learning. You won't have to know the difference between those for the exam. All I want you to know is that interference in general is when we've learned something and it interferes with our ability to recall something else that we've learned. So I won't ask you to know retroactive or proactive, just to know in general how interference works. Sometimes we're motivated to forget things, particularly traumatic events. The idea is that sometimes we just don't want to think about them. But there's also this idea that comes from the psychodynamic Freudian theory that sometimes events are so traumatic that we can't really handle them very well, our psyche. And so subconsciously, the information is repressed or pushed into a part of the unconscious so that you don't have any recollection of the event. And there are lots of cases over the years, some of them kind of famous cases, where people go to therapy as adults because they're depressed or something. And in the course of therapy, they begin to have these recollections of things that happened in their childhood that they had no recollection of at that point in their life. And the idea is that these repressed memories were recovered from the unconscious, and that could be the root of some of your adult depression or something like that. Well, that was a very popular idea for many years, but there's an increasing number of researchers who think that repression is very rare, probably much more rare than you're led to believe by things you see in the media or in movies and stuff like that. This is certainly a possibility, but probably not that common. One thing I would add to this is we know for sure from research that using hypnosis to recover repressed memories from the unconscious is a big no-no. That information would not be allowed in the court of law in a trial, because when you are under hypnosis, you are in a very suggestible state, and it's very easy for people to create images in their mind under hypnosis of things that didn't happen. And the problem is, when you come out of hypnosis, now that image that you created, that you imagined under hypnosis, is actually stored like a real memory, and it can even have all the emotional components to it that a real traumatic memory would have. And there were a lot of cases in the 80s and early 90s of people going under hypnosis to retrieve repressed memories, and a lot of memories involving satanic rituals and sexual abuse and all kinds of stuff. And those really all panned out to be false memories that were created under hypnosis. So we don't use hypnosis to retrieve memories in psychology. And quite honestly, a lot of those cases involved just a small handful of psychologists. Well, learn from our mistakes for sure. The misinformation effect is when information is provided to us that distorts our memory or affects how we recall information. And Elizabeth Loftus did an interesting experiment. Well, she's a memory researcher, one of the most famous memory researchers, particularly with memory errors. And she's done a lot of really cool experiments that demonstrate how malleable memory is and how easy it is to create false memories. One of them she did, though, with the misinformation effect, was had people watch footage of an actual car accident, and then she would ask some of them how fast the cars were going when they hit each other. But other observers were asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other. And so just changing the word in the sentence from hit to smashed produced the people who heard the word smashed gave much higher estimates of speed at the moment of impact. So she kind of like put into their head, by using the word smashed, that these cars were traveling at a high rate of speed, and people actually recalled the cars as traveling faster than they did. I believe those people also were more likely to recall seeing broken glass on the ground, which in the video there was no broken glass on the ground, things like that. So I'm going to show you another short video, and this one has to do with eyewitness identification, and it also shows an example of the misinformation effect.